The show begins with our main character, Song, a beautiful young woman entering her house to find another woman's clothing all over the floor. Shocked, she walks upstairs, and when she enters the bedroom, she catches her husband, Lee, with her best friend, Lindsay. This sends her heroine into a rage, and she accuses her friend of ruining her relationship. She also demands to know why Lee is betraying her. In response, Lindsay hands over divorce papers and says that Lee is done with her. Stunned, Song approaches Lee and demands the truth. Sadly, he replies that he's always liked Lindsay, and he wants to spend the rest of his life with her. Following this, a devastated Song walks out of the house and gets in her car. She then drives at night reminiscing about the good times with Lee. Crying, she thinks it really takes very little for humans to change and show their true colors. Right then, we're shown a medical report that mentions Song's pregnancy. It turns out she visited Lee to tell him about it. At the same time, a truck comes at her at high speed and hits her car, critically injuring her. The driver then gets out of the truck, makes a call, and says the task is complete. The scene then fast-forwards 6 years to the present, where Lee scolds his assistant for still not being able to locate Song after so many years. Here we learn that after Song's disappearance, Lee has been searching for her everywhere. Later, when Lee and his assistant are leaving, a beautiful woman walks past them and enters the office. Surprised, Lee turns and realizes that the perfume the girl is wearing is the same one Song used to wear. He then asks her name and which department she's working in. In reply, she says that her name is Song, and she's a new hire. Lee is shocked to hear his wife's name, but his assistant snaps him out of it when he's told that she's actually his new secretary. Next, we're shown glimpses of the past where Song underwent facial surgery after her accident and also gave birth to a baby boy. It's revealed that Song's son is suffering from a severe disease and requires his biological father's blood to be cured. This is the reason why she returned. Later, Lee calls Song into his office and asks if they've met before. Our heroine replies that she's new to the city, and it's her first time working for the company. Lee mentions how her perfume reminds him of someone special, and Song states that it seems like he really misses her. During their conversation, Lee gets a little too close to Song, causing her to spill coffee on his shirt. She offers to have it cleaned, but he declines the offer. Later, Lee calls Song and reminds her to attend an important client meeting. The meeting becomes more of a party, and Lee drinks so much that he stumbles around and eventually passes out. Seizing the opportunity, Song attempts to unbutton her shirt, but he quickly grabs her hand, stopping her. Nervous and panicked, Song leaves the room and tells Lee's assistant that their boss is drunk and passed out. To her surprise, the assistant tells her that although Lee is drunk, he is always aware of his surroundings. The following day, Lee calls Song into his office and fires her for her inappropriate actions. Song pleads for another chance, but Lee stands firm and dismisses her. Later, when Lee leaves his office, he notices that Song is nowhere to be found. He asks an employee who reveals that Song had an urgent call and had to rush to the hospital. She goes on to say that Song promised to collect her belongings the next day. The mention of the hospital causes Lee to think of his sick grandfather, and he decides to visit him in the hospital. A little while later, he approaches the hospital, and a young boy walks up to him and addresses him as father. Lee tries to discourage the boy from doing so, but the child explains that he's doing so because someone is bothering him. Impressed by the boy's resourcefulness, Lee asks about his parents. However, the boy leaves, saying he lives with his mother and has never met his father. As Lee makes his way to his grandfather's hospital room, he notices Song, a doctor, and the same boy playing together. As he walks away, he can't help but be curious about them. When Lee finally meets his grandfather, the elderly man begs him to find Song, convinced she's the only one who can aid his recovery. At this moment, Lee reflects on the day Song left him and regrets not following her. At night, Lee sends an urgent message to Song asking her to come pick him up. She leaves her sleeping son to help, but when she arrives, she notices Lee is drunk once again and gently suggests that problems aren't solved with alcohol. Song opens up about her own issues, and during their conversation, things escalate, resulting in a passionate kiss. They retreat to a room to continue. However, Song suddenly remembers how Lee abandoned her in the past, prompting her to abruptly leave. Analepsis takes us to the day of Song's accident. She can be seen begging the truck driver to spare her life. Initially resolute, the driver changes his mind when he learns of her pregnancy, but insists that she never return to the city. A little while later, Dr. Yu Hong discovers Song lying injured in the middle of the road. He takes her to the hospital, tends to her wounds, and performs facial surgery to alter her appearance. Hong then suggests that changing her identity will allow her to return to the city and seek revenge. In the present, Lee arrives at the office only to find that Song has already collected her belongings and left. Feeling a sense of loss, he promptly calls her and persuades her to return to the job. Song considers the offer and eventually accepts. A while later, Linja arrives at the office to meet Lee, but to her dismay, Song stops her from barging in and asks if she has an appointment. Linja tries to pull rank, claiming to be the future boss of the company, but Song digs in her heels and doesn't let her pass. A furious Linja goes to hit Song, but Lee arrives just in time to separate the two and invite Linja in. After hours, Song visits Lee's office and suggests he go home. Lee, however, says he still has work to do. Song then leaves the office and turns off the lights. Here it's revealed that Lee has a fear of the dark, and as soon as Song returns with a flashlight, he approaches her and hugs her tightly, expressing gratitude for her return. When the lights are turned back on, they separate, and Lee wonders why Song brought a flashlight, as if she knew about his fear. Song manages to convince him that she simply came back to retrieve her belongings. The following day, Song and Lee have coffee to discuss an idea for a client meeting. Unfortunately, during the meeting, Song starts to feel off and begins gasping for breath. Lee immediately recognizes that she's having an allergic reaction to coffee, just like his ex-wife, so he rushes her to the hospital. The sight of Lee carrying Song shocks all the office employees. At the hospital, Song has a traumatic flashback to the time when the truck driver brutally beat her. Lee manages to bring her back to reality and asks her what the fuck that was about. Song says nothing, leaving Lee to believe that she simply has a dark past. At that moment, Lee's assistant calls him to share some background information about Song. He found out that she recently moved to the city from a village. Lee is left wondering how a girl from a village could have so many similarities to his missing wife. Later, Lee asks Song why she applied to be his secretary. She cleverly responds that she needed the money, and she heard that Lee was very handsome. Just then, Dr. Hung enters the room, posing as the primary doctor, and reassures Lee that Song's illness was due to excessive stress, not coffee. Later, as she is being discharged from the hospital, Hung pulls Song aside and emphasizes that someone is snooping around, so she needs to be diligent in protecting herself. The next day at the office, Lee approaches Song and presents her with a beautiful dress. However, she hesitates to accept it, explaining that since he carried her to the hospital, the office's perception of her has changed and receiving a gift might raise suspicions. Lee clarifies that it's not a gift, but a dress for a client's event that will be held that night. He then sternly warns nearby employees that anyone gossiping about Song will be fired immediately. At the party, Song arrives looking stunning in the dress, and Lee notices her talking to an unfamiliar man. Jealous, he approaches her and escorts her away for a drink. Right then, Linja arrives at the party and offers a drink to Lee, but to her dismay, he instead takes the drink offered by Song and after a while, falls unconscious. Here, we learn that Dr. Hung and Song were in cahoots and spiked his drink. Song then takes the helpless Lee to a hotel room and begins to take advantage of him. She even goes so far as to draw a turtle on his cheek. The next day, Lee wakes up in the hotel room surprised to see Linja coming out of the bathroom. It turns out that Song somehow locked Linja in there to ensure that she couldn't interrupt Lee and Song's time together. Confused, Lee asks Linja about the person he'd spent the and she angrily assumes that it might be his new secretary, Song. This angers Lee, prompting him to call his assistant to investigate the woman he'd been with. Afterward, Lee goes straight to the office and is confused why Song isn't there. This deepens his suspicion about her, but then his assistant enters the room and provides surveillance footage from outside Lee's hotel room, revealing that Song hasn't stayed for long, and that Linja had. They also discover that some footage is missing, leading them to suspect someone is deliberately tampering with the evidence. While discussing these developments, they decide to go to a restaurant. There they spot Song with a group of sketchy individuals. When one of the men forcefully grabs Song's hand, Lee promptly steps in, whisking her away. He cautions her to be aware of those with questionable intentions. Touched by Lee's concern, Song asks if she sees his wife and her, and urges him to look into her eyes. Lee does so, and he remembers when he left Song to wait for him in the exact location. One thing leads to another, and they end up kissing. Next, Song receives an unexpected call from Linja, inviting her to a restaurant. When her heroine arrives, the cunning woman urges her to quit her job and distance herself from Lee. Song scoffs at her, leading to a full-blown confrontation. At that moment, Lee arrives, and Linja turns to him, pleading with him to confess his love for her. However, as he's about to express his feelings for Song, she decides to leave, prompting him to grab a hold of her hand. At the same time, Dr. Hung appears and leads Song away, while cautioning Lee to behave himself. Later on their way home, Lin suddenly stops the car and asks Linja to get out. He can't stop thinking about Song, and rushes to her home to confess his feelings. Meanwhile, Linja makes a call, asking a mysterious person for information on Song. A little while later, Lee arrives at Song's place and rings the bell. She's surprised to see him and asks why he's there. Lee explains that he's there to answer her questions and emphasizes that he has no romantic feelings for Linja. He asks to come inside, but Song is hesitant, worried about introducing him to her son. Nonetheless, Lee enters and immediately recognizes him as the little boy who had earlier referred to him as father. As they talk, Song is compelled to introduce the little boy on as her brother's son. Her son plays along, calling her aunt. Hearing this, Lee believes that the little boy is Song's nephew. The next day, Song doesn't finally hit the office and asks her colleagues about his whereabouts. The colleague explains that it's the 6th anniversary of Lee's ex-wife's disappearance. On this day every year, he goes to the hills, where he sets up a memorial for her. He spends the entire day there, and doesn't return until the evening. Learning this, Song is filled with emotions and surprise, relieved that Lee still thinks of her. Here, we learn that Lee betrayed Song to protect her from the troubles he was facing when his company went bankrupt. He wanted her to have a normal life, so he left her, despite his grandfather's objections. Later that night, Lee is alone at his apartment, so he calls Song and invites her to cook some food for him. She promptly arrives, but scolds him and reminds him that she's his secretary, not his maid. Suddenly, Lee gets close to her and opens up about his true feelings. He proposes marriage to her, but gives her 3 days to answer him. As Lee returns home from the office the next day, he spots in near a park, crying and waiting for Song. He approaches the little boy, who begs for a playmate. Feeling bad for him, Lee obliges and plays with him until Song arrives. They enjoy their time together, but suddenly, An faints, and they rush him to a hospital. It's then that Lee discovers that An has a serious illness, and becomes deeply saddened and concerned. In the next scene, Song visits Lee and accepts his marriage proposal. However, to her surprise, Lee backpedals and suggests they date before rushing into marriage. They then go for a drive, and Song asks him why he left his wife if he loved her so much. Lee finally reveals that he left her to protect her from financial troubles after his company went bankrupt. Hearing this, Song realizes that he was trying to protect her, and Linzai was the one behind her near a fatal accident. The following morning, Lee receives a call from his assistant, informing him that his long-lost wife has been found, and she is none other than his assistant, Song. Lee also learns that Linzai orchestrated an accident on the night of their breakup, intending to harm Song. He realizes that Song had surgery, which is why she looks so different. Right then, Lee receives a from Linzai, and he confronts her for trying to harm his wife. He also threatens her into confessing to her crime. Later at the office, when Song approaches Lee to discuss work, the latter suddenly hugs her tightly and mentions that he's well aware of her identity and misses her so much. Eventually, the two reconcile, but get news that An has gone missing. Soon, Linzai calls Song and informs her that she's kidnapped and tells her to come to meet alone if she ever wants to see her following orders. Song arrives and pleads with Linzai not to hurt her son. In reply, this slag tells Song to kill herself and disappear from her and Lee's life. Desperate to save her son, Song grabs a knife and gets ready to stab herself when Lee arrives and stops her. Linzai tries to pull him away, but during the scuffle, the knife stabs Lee in the chest, and he falls to the ground. He's then rushed to the hospital, where the doctor urges him to find a blood donor ASAP. Unfortunately, after an exhaustive search, they find no suitable match. Just then, the little boy, An, offers to donate his blood. Initially, Song refuses, warning of the dangers, but after a lot of consideration, she agrees. Eventually, Lee regains consciousness and immediately goes to meet his son. Here, Lee and Song are informed that their son needs a bone marrow transplant to survive. In the last scene, while the couple is searching for a bone marrow donor, they get a letter from Linzai, apologizing for everything. She also reveals that she's a match and offers to donate her bone marrow to An.